Hey everybody, welcome back to the program. So I recently finished watching the new Beach Boys documentary on Disney Plus. I mean, what else was I gonna do, right? I had to buy a whole month of it just to watch Let It Be. So I was like, I watched some Muppets, watched the Beach Boys documentary. Anyway, I thought it was good marketing on Disney's. In this video, I'm gonna talk about the positives and negatives, my key takeaways, and ultimately decide if it's worth watching if you're on the fence. With all that though, I just want to take a moment and ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It really does make a difference. Thank you to those who already have. All right, on with the video. All right, first up, I loved the inclusion of all the vintage home film footage. I loved all that candid stuff. And I also really liked how they included vintage interview footage. I thought that was really a smart move. I also really love this moment when, I think it was Brian fades down all the other instruments on Don't Worry Baby and all you hear is their voices. And that was such a powerful moment because it showed you without using words just how magical the Beach Boys are and what they did so well with their harmonies. I mean, that song works without all the other instruments. It's just incredible. And I really love the introduction of the Beatles to the documentary. It was actually pretty funny. So the Beach Boys are in New Zealand. They hear about this new band that came to America and they're like, no big deal, whatever. And then everything changes. It's incredible. And there's this really great intercut between the Beatles and the Beach Boys. It really shows that friendly rivalry the two bands had. Lastly, I really appreciated the little reunion we got at the very end. The big one for me was the timeline. It felt muddy. Sometimes I knew where we were, but sometimes they would compress several years together and it was just kind of a blur. And there was also some really big gaps. I also thought it was unfortunate that Mike Love felt like he had to sue Brian Wilson over music royalties, but I think it's weird the way the documentary handled it. Like they brought it up like it was this big deal. Mike says that he still loves Brian. They show him reuniting with Brian at the end with the other living members, but that's it. They just sort of bring it up and then leave it hanging. It feels really unresolved. I also thought it was strange that they gloss over Brian's mental health struggles and him basically being a prisoner of his own psychologist. And I really didn't like how the death of Carl and Dennis was literally just a footnote at the very end of the film. I would have liked to have seen how their death had an impact on the band. I mean, I'm sure that was a big deal. Also, I found it strange that at the very end they bring up the fact that Pet Sounds became gold status in 2000 and then 2 weeks later it went platinum, but they don't give any context as to why. Like what happened in the year 2000 to make this album go gold? It's very strange that they just kind of threw that in there. And then like no response from the band. That all being said, I did come away from this documentary learning a few things, or at least some things that were new to me. Like the first one being, early on, a lot of the weight of the band to create these hits was on Brian Wilson. But what I think is sad is that it took his mental breakdown to allow the other members to start contributing, writing music, producing. It's almost like he had to go away and then the other members stepped up. But I just think about where this band could have been had they all from the get-go been included or felt like they were worthy. I mean, who knows what it would have taken, but I just think about the trajectory of that band and had they had been at Monterey Pop Festival with this new sound, I think the name hurt them, but also they couldn't shake this image, this early 60s image. Like they were changing with the times, but this image stuck with them, unfortunately. Like they weren't given a fair shot. So I think about that and I just think about all the music that could have been had there been more of a communal process, but who knows? Maybe Brian needed to be by himself to create the music that he did create, especially on Pet Sounds. I don't know, but it's just something that I hadn't really thought about until this documentary. And lastly, the way they handled Murray Wilson I thought was really interesting. That's the dad of Brian, Dennis, and Carl. I thought they did a good job showing both sides of him. I knew that he wasn't the greatest of guys. This is a dude who they fired, and then he ended up creating a knockoff band of his sons. That's a whole separate story. But, you know, what they did show was like, yeah, he made some poor choices along the way, but Brian Wilson's ex-wife does defend him by saying, you know, he loved his kids in his own way, and he was protecting them. So who's to say where they would have ended up if they didn't have his guidance early on? But there's no excuse for the abuse that he did to his kids. And it was so heartbreaking to hear him and Brian arguing in the recording studio. I mean, just the way he talked to Brian, it was hard to hear that. This was a really well put together documentary. It's very professional. It sounds great. The footage was fantastic. And I really enjoyed the editing, especially editing to Beach Boy music, even some Beatles music. I thought everything was really, really top notch. I think what this documentary does best is give you a broad overview of the Beach Boys. Like, it hits all the major life events, the big album releases, the big single releases. It plays a lot of the music. It really makes you excited to learn about the Beach Boys, to get into their music. I think they connected the dots along of the Beach Boys timeline very well, but it does tend to drop off after Pet Sounds. And it really does move along at a great clip. I mean, it just breezes along, but we miss out on a lot of details because of this, because it's only 2 hours. I think the filmmakers did a fantastic job with what they had, but they couldn't probe that deep. I also think they had to be careful because they needed the blessings of the surviving members of the Beach Boys, which means you probably don't get into too much controversial material, which is probably why they didn't really go much into the lawsuits that Mike Love has filed against Brian Wilson. So we definitely miss out on a lot of details. That being said, though, I think there was room to make this a much larger, like a 6-part miniseries, like each episode 2 hours. Like, we start with the the formation, the early 60s, go to the mid 60s, go to the late 60s, and then into the 70s, finally the 80s, and then maybe end with like the, Kokomo and all of that. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. But I just blame Disney for making the filmmakers compress this into 2 hours. I don't think there was any reason to, and there's plenty of archival interview footage, not to mention all the new footage that they shot. And it would have been nice to spend a little bit more time with the reunited surviving members of the Beach Boys. I mean, I thought that was a beautiful moment, and maybe there was reasons we don't get to hear what they talked about, but I just would have liked to have seen a little bit more of that, a little bit more of them together, because quite possibly that might be the last time we ever see them all together. I think this is a great documentary for anyone interested on the Beach Boys, a little curious. It's a very good overview. It does spur curiosity to learn more about them, to dive into their music. I think for longtime fans, though, it will leave you wanting more because it doesn't probe very deep, and it does gloss over a lot of stuff. So you're probably not going to learn anything new. That being said, though, still watch it anyway. It was a fun watch. I really enjoyed it. It reminded me why I love the music. It brought back a lot of memories for me, especially since I've been listening to the Beach Boys since I was in high school. I mean, there's a lot tied to this music, and I just think we're in this day and age where we can do better. We can do more. I mean, look what we got with Get Back, and that was like vintage footage. We can create anything with this Beach Boys stuff. I mean, it was literally just compiling, editing. I'm ranting here. That's it. Let me know what you think. I also have a couple other Beach Boys videos you might be interested in. I have this whole video about the lost album of the Beach Boys recording with Charlie Manson. It's a crazy story. I also have my top 10 favorite Beach Boys albums. But until then, let me know what you thought of the documentary with a comment down below. Until then, thank you all so much for watching, but I especially want to thank my members over on Patreon. I'm your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side.